You are thinking right now. A thought is occurring, words forming in your mind, ideas assembling, meaning emerging from the neural activity of 100 billion neurons firing in patterns so complex that no computer on Earth can simulate them. You are thinking, this seems obvious, this seems undeniable, this seems like the most basic, most certain, most unquestionable fact about your existence, the fact that Descartes placed at the foundation of all knowledge. I think, therefore I am. But stop. Look at the thought you are thinking right now. Look at it carefully. Not at its content, not at what the thought is about, but at its origin. Where did the thought come from? Did you choose it? Did you decide, before the thought appeared, to think this specific thought rather than some other thought? Did you select it from a menu of possible thoughts, evaluate the options, and deliberately choose this one? Or did the thought simply appear, arriving in your awareness, without invitation, without selection, without any conscious act of production on your part? Be honest. The thought appeared. You did not produce it. You did not choose it. You did not author it. The thought arrived in your consciousness the way a bird arrives on a branch from somewhere else, under its own power, according to its own logic. You did not summon the bird. You noticed the bird, and the thought is the same. You did not summon it. You noticed it. The thought appeared, and then a fraction of a second later you noticed it, and then another fraction of a second later you claimed it. My thought, my idea, my decision. Try this experiment right now. Close your eyes for 10 seconds and try not to think. Try to have zero thoughts. You cannot. The thoughts come anyway, unbidden, uninvited, arising from somewhere below the surface of awareness like bubbles from the bottom of a lake. You did not produce the bubbles. You did not decide to generate them. They rose on their own, from a source you cannot see, according to a logic you cannot control. And when they reached the surface, when they entered your conscious awareness, you claimed them. I am thinking about dinner. No. A thought about dinner appeared in your consciousness. You noticed it, and then you identified with it. You collapsed the distance between the awareness and the thought, merged the observer with the observed, and concluded that you and the thought are the same thing, that the thought is yours, that you are the thinker. But are you? What if the relationship between you and your thoughts is not the relationship between an author and a book, but the relationship between a screen and a movie? The screen does not produce the movie. The screen displays the movie. The screen is there before the movie starts, during the movie, and after the movie ends. The screen does not change when the movie changes. The screen does not become sad when the character is sad, or frightened when the character is frightened, or dead when the character dies. The screen is the unchanging medium on which the changing content is displayed. And you, the awareness, the consciousness, the thing that is reading these words right now might be the screen, not the movie, not the character in the movie, not the plot, or the dialogue, or the emotional arc. The screen, the awareness on which the thoughts, the emotions, the sensations, and the entire drama of your identity is projected. I am thinking this thought, but the claiming came after the thinking. The I arrived after the thought. The author showed up after the book was already written. This is not philosophy. This is neuroscience, measured, quantified, published, and replicated in laboratories around the world, and the findings are among the most disturbing in the history of brain science. Benjamin Libet, a neurophysiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, performed the experiment that shattered the assumption of conscious authorship in 1983. Libet asked participants to make a simple voluntary movement to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it. While they moved, Libet measured three things: the time of the wrist movement, recorded by a muscle sensor, the time of the conscious decision to move, recorded by the participant, who watched a clock and reported when they first felt the urge to flex, and the time of the brain's preparation for movement, recorded by an EEG electrode measuring the readiness potential, the electrical buildup in the motor cortex that precedes voluntary movement. The results overturn 3 centuries of philosophical assumption. The readiness potential, the brain's preparation for movement, began approximately 550 milliseconds before the movement. The conscious decision, the participants' reported awareness of the urge to move, occurred approximately 200 milliseconds before the movement. The brain began preparing the movement 350 milliseconds before the person was consciously aware of deciding to move. The brain decided first. The conscious mind noticed second. And the decision that the conscious mind experienced as its own, "I have decided to flex my wrist," was not a decision at all. It was a notification. The brain was informing the conscious mind of a decision that had already been made by processes that the conscious mind had no access to, no awareness of, and no control over. Libet himself recognized the disturbing implications of his finding and proposed a qualification that he called the conscious veto. The readiness potential begins 550 milliseconds before the action. The conscious awareness of the decision occurs at 200 milliseconds. The action occurs at 0. Between 200 and 0, in the 200 milliseconds after the conscious mind becomes aware of the impending action. But before the action is executed, the conscious mind can veto the action. It can say no. It can cancel the movement that the brain has already begun preparing. The veto is real. Libet documented it experimentally, showing that participants could abort movements that they had already decided to make. The conscious mind cannot initiate, but it can inhibit. It cannot start the action, but it can stop it. The veto is important, and we explored its significance in the free will investigation. But for the identity investigation, the more significant finding is not the veto, but the initiation. Because the initiation reveals that the I, the conscious self that you experience as the author of your actions, does not author your actions. It edits them. The I is not the writer. It is the editor reviewing the drafts that the unconscious mind produces, approving some, vetoing others, but never writing the first draft. The first draft is always unconscious. The authorship is always below the surface. And the I that takes credit for the finished product, "I decided to move my wrist," is claiming authorship of a text it did not write. The implications are vertiginous. If the brain initiates actions before the conscious mind decides to perform them, then who is deciding? Not you, not the conscious, deliberate, self-aware I that you experience as the author of your actions. The decisions are made by unconscious processes, by neural computations that occur below the threshold of awareness, in the vast computational space of the brain that Zoltman's research identified as 95% of all cognitive activity. The conscious mind, the I, is not the decision maker. It is the press secretary, the spokesperson who announces decisions that were made elsewhere by someone else for reasons that the spokesperson does not know and cannot investigate. John Dylan Haynes, a neuroscientist at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin, extended Libet's finding with fMRI, technology that allowed him to look deeper into the brain's decision-making process. In 2008, Haynes published a study in Nature Neuroscience showing that the outcome of a simple decision, whether to press a button with the left hand or the right hand, could be predicted from brain activity up to 7 seconds before. The participant was consciously aware of making the decision. 7 seconds, not 350 milliseconds, as Libet had found. 7 full seconds, an eternity in neural time, long enough to formulate a sentence, long enough to change your mind, long enough to have several other thoughts between the brain's decision and your awareness of it. For 7 seconds, your brain knew what you were going to do, and you did not. For 7 seconds, the you that you experience as the author of your actions was completely uninformed about the action that you were about to perform. In 2013, Haynes extended the finding further, showing that for more complex decisions, the predictive window extends to 10 seconds or more. A full 10 seconds of brain activity preceding the conscious awareness of a decision. Haynes's finding was confirmed and extended by Chun-Seong Soon at the same Berlin Institute, who used pattern recognition algorithms to decode the brain's pre-decision activity with even greater precision. The algorithms could predict not merely whether the participant would press the left or right button, but could identify the specific neural patterns that preceded each type of decision, patterns that were stable, reliable, and detectable long before the participant reported any conscious awareness of deciding. The conscious mind is not merely late to the party, it is arriving after the party is over, after the decisions have been made, the actions have been initiated, and the outcomes have been determined by neural processes that operate entirely outside the conscious mind's awareness, and entirely without the conscious mind's participation. Michael Gazzaniga, a neuroscientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and one of the founders of cognitive neuroscience, discovered something even more disturbing about the conscious mind's relationship to the decisions it claims to make. Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, individuals whose corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the 2 hemispheres of the brain, had been surgically severed to treat severe epilepsy. In split-brain patients, the 2 hemispheres cannot communicate. Each hemisphere processes information independently. Each has its own perceptions, its own knowledge, and its own responses. Gazzaniga's experiments revealed a phenomenon he called the left hemisphere interpreter, a narrative function in the left hemisphere that generates explanations for behaviors that the left hemisphere did not initiate and does not understand. In one famous experiment, Gazzaniga presented a snow scene to the right hemisphere, which controls the left hand, and a chicken claw to the left hemisphere, which controls the right hand. The patient was asked to point to related pictures with each hand. The right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, which saw the chicken claw, correctly pointed to a picture of a chicken. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, which saw the snow scene, correctly pointed to a picture of a shovel. So far, so logical. But when Gazzaniga asked the patient why they had pointed to the shovel with their left hand, the left hemisphere, which had not seen the snow scene, which had no idea why the left hand had pointed to the shovel, did not say, "I don't know." It invented an explanation. "Oh, the shovel is for cleaning out the chicken shed," the patient said, confidently, fluently, without any awareness that the explanation was a fabrication. The left hemisphere did not know the real reason for the action, but it could not tolerate not knowing. So it made something up, and it believed its own fabrication. And it presented the fabrication as the truth, as a genuine account of its own decision-making process, as the real reason for the action, as the authentic narrative of a self that is in control of its own behavior. The left hemisphere interpreter does not merely explain split-brain behavior. It operates in every brain, in every moment, in every act of self-narration. When you explain why you made a decision, why you chose this job, why you married this person, why you prefer this restaurant, you are activating the left hemisphere interpreter. And the explanations it produces are not necessarily the real reasons for your decisions. They are the best stories the interpreter can construct from the information available to it, which is, by definition, incomplete. because the interpreter does not have access to the unconscious processes that actually drove the decision. You are confabulating, not lying. Lying requires the awareness that the story is false. Confabulating, generating a plausible, coherent, internally consistent narrative that feels true, that you believe to be true, that you would defend as true, but that is, in fact, a post hoc construction that bears an uncertain relationship to the actual causal processes that produced the behavior it purports to explain. Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson, psychologists at the University of Michigan, documented the scope of the confabulation in a landmark 1977 paper titled "Telling More Than We Can Know." Nisbett and Wilson demonstrated that people routinely cannot accurately report the reasons for their own decisions, preferences, and behaviors. In one study, shoppers were asked to evaluate 4 identical pairs of stockings arranged on a table. The shoppers consistently preferred the pair on the right, a well-documented position effect in which the rightmost item is chosen more frequently. But when asked why they preferred their chosen pair, no shopper mentioned the position. Instead, they cited the quality, the texture, the color, the weave, attributes that were identical across all 4 pairs. The shoppers did not know the real reason for their preference, but they confidently, fluently, articulately, with complete conviction, explained a reason that was entirely fabricated. The interpreter was interpreting, and the interpretation was wrong. In another study, Nisbett and Wilson asked participants to memorize word pairs, some of which contained words associated with specific products, like ocean and moon, which primed the detergent brand, Tide. When later asked to name their preferred laundry detergent, primed participants disproportionately chose Tide, but when asked why, none mentioned the word pairs. They cited the brand's cleaning power, its price, their mother's preference, the smell, all fabricated, all wrong, all produced with complete confidence by a narrator who genuinely believed its own narrative. The phenomenon extends beyond trivial consumer choices. Timothy Wilson's subsequent research, documented in his book, Strangers to Ourselves, demonstrated that people are systematically wrong about what makes them happy, what they will regret, how they will feel about future events, and what motivates their most important decisions. The I that narrates your life does not know you. The interpreter does not understand the text it is interpreting. The author of your life story is unreliable, and the unreliability is not a bug, it is a feature. The interpreter's function is not accuracy. Its function is coherence, the production of a continuous, consistent, plausible narrative that creates the illusion of a unified self in control of its own actions. The narrative is functional. It is useful. It serves the organism's social needs, creating a predictable, accountable, socially legible person that other people can relate to, trust, and cooperate with. But the narrative is not true. It is not an accurate account of the decision-making processes that actually drive behavior. It is a press release, a carefully crafted public statement that bears the same relationship to internal reality that a corporate press release bears to the actual boardroom deliberations. The narrative self, the I that tells the story of your life, that maintains the sense of continuous identity across time, that binds your memories into a coherent autobiography and your intentions into a coherent plan, is maintained by the default mode network, the brain system we have encountered in every investigation since the Heart series. The DMN is active when the brain is not engaged in a specific task, when you are daydreaming, reminiscing, planning, imagining, or simply resting. And the primary function of the DMN, as Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard demonstrated in a 2010 study, is mind-wandering, the continuous generation of self-referential thought, the ongoing narrative of me that plays like a background soundtrack to every waking moment. I need to remember to buy groceries. I wonder what she thinks of me. I should have said something different yesterday. I am going to succeed at this project. The narrative is continuous. It is automatic. And it is here is the critical finding associated with unhappiness. Killingsworth and Gilbert found that people are less happy when their minds are wandering than when they are focused on the present moment, regardless of what they are doing. Killingsworth and Gilbert's study, published in Science in 2010, under the title "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," sampled over 2,200 adults at random moments throughout their day using a smartphone app. The app asked 3 questions. What are you doing right now? Is your mind wandering? How happy are you? The results were stark. People's minds wandered 46.9% of the time. Nearly half of all waking moments were spent in DMN-generated self-referential thought rather than in present-moment awareness. And the mind wandering was associated with lower happiness regardless of the activity. People were less happy when their minds wandered during pleasant activities than when they were fully present during unpleasant activities. The wandering itself, the narrative, the self-referential processing, the I, generating its endless commentary, was the source of the unhappiness, not the circumstances, not the external conditions, the internal narrator. The narrative self, the I, is not merely a confabulator. It is a confabulator that makes you unhappy. The story it tells is not merely inaccurate, it is unpleasant, saturated with regret about the past, anxiety about the future, comparison with others, and the chronic low-grade dissatisfaction that the Buddhist tradition calls dukkha, and that the neuroscience associates with excessive DMN activity. But here is the finding that connects the neuroscience to the deepest insights of the contemplative traditions. When the narrative self is silenced, when the DMN's self-referential processing is reduced, whether through focused meditation, through psychedelic experience, through flow states, or through the extreme physiological conditions of near-death, consciousness does not disappear. Consciousness remains. In fact, consciousness often intensifies. The colors become more vivid, the perception becomes more acute, the sense of presence, of being here, now, in this moment, deepens. And the sense of being a separate self, the I, that narrates, that judges, that compares, that regrets and worries, dissolves. The narrative stops, but the awareness continues. The story ends, but the reader remains. Judson Brewer, a neuroscientist at Brown University whose meditation research we encountered in previous investigations, documented this directly using real-time fMRI neurofeedback. Brewer trained experienced meditators to observe their own DMN activity on a screen while they meditated. When the meditators engaged in self-referential thinking, I am meditating, I am doing well, I wonder if I'm doing this right, the DMN lit up on the screen. When the meditators released the self-referential thinking, when they dropped the I and simply rested in open, non-narrative awareness, the DMN went quiet. And the meditators consistently reported that the quiet state, the state without the I, without the narrative, without the self-referential commentary, was not empty. It was full of awareness, full of presence, full of a clarity that the narrative self's constant chatter normally obscures. The experienced meditators in Brewer's study had a name for this distinction. They called the narrative self the small self, the constructed, narrated, confabulated I that the DMN generates, and they called the awareness that remains when the small self is silent the large self, or simply awareness, or presence, or being. The small self comes and goes. The large self remains. The small self narrates, judges, compares, worries, and regrets. The large self watches, and the watching the silent, steady, unchanging awareness that watches the small self's drama without being caught in it is what the traditions have been pointing toward for millennia. This is the most important finding in consciousness research and the most underappreciated. Consciousness and the self are not the same thing. The I is not the awareness. The I is a narrative, a story that the brain tells, a model that the DMN generates, a confabulation that the left hemisphere interpreter produces. And the awareness, the consciousness that perceives the story, that watches the narrative, that notices the thoughts as they arrive and depart, is something else, something deeper, something that was there before the story started and that remains when the story stops. Something that the traditions call by 1,000 names: the witness, the Atman, the Buddha nature, the soul, the true self, Turiya, the clear light, and that the neuroscience is only now beginning to distinguish from the narrative machinery that normally conceals it. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder, provides perhaps the most dramatic illustration of the distinction between consciousness and identity. In DID, a single brain hosts multiple distinct personality states, each with its own name, its own voice, its own memories, its own emotional profile, and, in documented cases, its own physiological characteristics. Different personality states in the same individual have been documented to have different allergic responses, different visual acuity, different handedness, different brainwave patterns, and different responses to medication. The same brain, the same neurons, the same neurotransmitters, but different selves, different narrative identities, different confabulations, different stories about who I am. And the different selves alternate: one takes control, then recedes, another emerges, then withdraws. The body is continuous. The consciousness appears to be continuous. But the I, the specific narrative identity that claims ownership of the body and the consciousness at any given moment, switches. The identity is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is a program, a software configuration that can be swapped, replaced, overwritten by another program running on the same hardware. If multiple IS can inhabit the same brain, if identity is a software configuration rather than a hardware feature, then the I that you experience as your essential, permanent, irreducible self may be one program among many possible programs. The research on DID has revealed measurable physiological differences between personality states that cannot be explained by acting or suggestion. Putnam and colleagues at the National Institute of Mental Health documented changes in visual evoked potentials, galvanic skin response, and regional cerebral blood flow between different personality states in the same individual changes that trained actors attempting to simulate different personalities could not reproduce. The personality states are not performances. They are genuine neurophysiological configurations, different patterns of brain activation, different autonomic profiles, different physiological states, all produced by the same brain, all running on the same hardware. The self is not a fact about the brain. It is a configuration of the brain, one possible configuration among many, selected by processes that the conscious mind does not control, and that can be disrupted by trauma, by suggestion, or by the contemplative practices that the traditions have been using for millennia to demonstrate the same insight that demonstrates through pathology. The I is not fixed. The program is running. The program feels real. The program produces a convincing, immersive, first-person experience of being a specific person with a specific history and a specific set of characteristics. But the program is not the hardware. The program is not the consciousness. And the program can be changed by brain damage, by dissociative processes, by extreme stress, by contemplative practice, and by the simple, devastating recognition that the program is a program rather than a fact. Russell Hurlburt, a psychologist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas has spent decades studying the actual content of people's inner experience using a method he calls descriptive experience sampling. Hurlburt gives participants a beeper that goes off at random intervals throughout the day. When the beep sounds, the participant captures whatever was occurring in their inner experience at that exact moment, not what they think should have been occurring, not what they remember occurring, but what was actually occurring at the instant the beep interrupted them. The findings are surprising. Most people believe they have a continuous inner monologue, a running stream of verbal thought that accompanies every waking moment. But Hurlburt's sampling reveals that inner speech is present in only about 25% of sampled moments for the average person. The rest of the time, inner experience consists of sensory awareness without verbal commentary, emotional feelings without verbal labels, or most remarkably, nothing at all. Blank moments. Moments in which no identifiable inner experience is occurring. The inner monologue that most people assume is continuous is, in fact, intermittent, present in some moments, absent in others, and far less pervasive than the illusion of continuity suggests. The gaps between thoughts are significant because they reveal that you exist in the gaps. When the inner monologue is silent, when no thought is occurring, when no narrative is being generated, when the left hemisphere interpreter is between fabrications, consciousness does not cease. You do not disappear. You are still there, still aware, still present, still conscious, but without the narrative overlay that normally accompanies consciousness. You are aware without being aware of anything in particular. You are conscious without thinking. You exist without narrating your existence. And the you that exists in the gap, the you that is present when the thoughts are absent, is the you that the traditions have been pointing toward for millennia, not the thinker. The awareness in which thinking occurs, not the narrator, the silence in which narration arises, not the I of the story, the consciousness that reads the story, and that was there before the story began, and that will be there after the story ends. The contemplative traditions have been pointing to this distinction between the narrative self and the witnessing awareness for millennia, and their methods for revealing the distinction are remarkably consistent across cultures. Every tradition prescribes a practice that involves the sustained observation of the mind's own activity, watching thoughts arise and pass away, noticing the gap between thoughts, distinguishing between the content of consciousness and the consciousness that contains the content. The Hindu tradition calls this practice Sakshi Bhava, the cultivation of the witness attitude. The Buddhist tradition calls it Satipatthana, the foundation of mindfulness. The Christian tradition calls it Contemplatio, the wordless awareness that remains when discursive prayer ceases. The Sufi tradition calls it Muraqabah, watchful presence. The names are different. The practice is the same, and the discovery that the practice produces is the same. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear. And the awareness, unlike the thoughts, does not come and go. It does not change. It does not age. It does not narrate. It simply is the unchanging ground, the silent screen, the clear space in which the entire movie of your identity is projected. The traditions discovered this through practice, through the sustained, disciplined observation of the mind's inner workings, that the contemplative traditions call meditation, contemplation, prayer, and self-inquiry. And the next part of this investigation will take the question into the quantum domain, where the physics of observation, measurement, and the collapse of the wave function converge on the same question that the neuroscience has raised and that the traditions have been answering for millennia. If you are not your thoughts, then what are you? And what is the thing that remains when the thoughts stop? The neuroscience established a paradox. The I that you experience as the author of your thoughts did not author them. The decisions were made before you were aware of deciding. The explanations you give for your behavior are confabulations, plausible stories, constructed after the fact by a narrator who does not have access to the actual reasons for the behavior. The narrative self is a construction, a software configuration maintained by the default mode network, dissolvable by meditation or psilocybin, replaceable by alternative configurations, as dissociative identity disorder demonstrates. And yet, when the narrative self dissolves, when the DMN goes quiet, when the I disappears, consciousness remains. Something is still aware, something is still present, something is still watching, but the something is not the narrator, not the confabulator, not the press secretary who was generating the illusion of authorship. The quantum physics of observation offers a framework for understanding what that something is, and the framework begins with a question that has haunted physics since the 1920s, a question that is structurally identical to the question that the neuroscience has raised about the self. Who is the observer? In quantum mechanics, the observer plays a role that has no parallel in any other branch of physics. Before observation, a quantum system exists in a superposition, a combination of all possible states, none of them definite, all of them potential. The electron does not have a definite position. It has a cloud of possible positions, each with a specific probability, all existing simultaneously in the wave function. The photon does not travel through one slit or the other. It travels through both, existing in a superposition of both paths simultaneously. The quantum system is indefinite. It is not that we do not know which state the system is in. It is that the system is not in any definite state. The indefiniteness is not a feature of our ignorance. It is a feature of reality. And then the observation occurs. Something looks, something measures, something interacts with the quantum system in a way that extracts information about it, and the superposition collapses. The cloud of possibilities becomes a single actuality. The electron has a definite position. The photon went through one slit. The indefinite becomes definite. The potential becomes actual. The observation creates the reality. But who is the observer? This is the measurement problem, the deepest unsolved problem in the foundations of quantum mechanics, debated for a century by the greatest physicists who have ever lived, and still unresolved. The problem is this. The mathematics of quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation, describes a deterministic, continuous, unitary evolution of the wave function. There is no collapse in the mathematics. The wave function evolves smoothly, continuously, without interruption. And yet we observe collapse, we observe definite outcomes, specific results, particular actualities emerging from the soup of possibilities. Something causes the collapse, something selects the actuality from the potential, something performs the measurement, but the mathematics does not say what. John von Neumann, the Hungarian-American mathematician who formalized quantum mechanics in his 1932 book, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, analyzed the measurement problem with characteristic rigor and arrived at a conclusion that most physicists found deeply uncomfortable. Von Neumann traced the chain of measurement from the quantum system to the detector, to the amplifier, to the recording device, to the human eye, to the optic nerve, to the visual cortex, and showed that at every stage of the chain, the quantum description applies. The detector, the amplifier, the recording device, the eye, the optic nerve, the visual cortex, all of these are physical systems. All of them are composed of atoms. All of them are subject to quantum mechanics. If the quantum system is in a superposition before measurement, then the detector that measures it enters a superposition of having detected outcome A and having detected outcome B. And the amplifier that reads the detector enters a superposition, and the recording device enters a superposition, and the eye enters a superposition, and the optic nerve, and the visual cortex. The superposition propagates up the chain from the quantum system through every physical device in the measurement apparatus without ever collapsing. Because every device in the chain is a physical system, and physical systems obey quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics does not produce collapse. The chain must end somewhere. The collapse must occur at some point. The indefinite must become definite. Von Neumann called this the psychophysical parallelism, the point at which the physical description of the world must give way to the psychological, the point at which the quantum mechanical chain terminates in the conscious experience of the observer. The chain can be cut at any point at the detector, at the amplifier, at the eye, and the quantum mathematics works equally well regardless of where the cut is placed. But the cut must be placed somewhere, and wherever it is placed, it divides the world into two parts. The quantum system, which is described by the Schrödinger equation and which can exist in superpositions, and the observer, which is not described by the Schrödinger equation and which always experiences definite outcomes. The division is not physical. There is no physical boundary, no special substance, no measurable property that distinguishes the quantum system from the observer. The division is conceptual. It is the division between the physical and the mental, between the described and the describer, between the world and the consciousness that experiences the world. This is why the measurement problem is not merely a technical problem in physics. It is a problem about the nature of consciousness. It is a problem about what kind of thing can lie outside the physical description of the world and yet interact with the physical world in a way that produces definite outcomes from indefinite possibilities. It is, in its deepest form, the identity question. What kind of entity is the observer? What is the consciousness that collapses the wave function? And is that consciousness the same thing as the narrative I that the neuroscience has identified as a confabulation, or is it something else entirely? And von Neumann concluded reluctantly, carefully, with full awareness of the philosophical implications that the chain ends at consciousness. The collapse occurs when a conscious mind observes the result. Consciousness is not a physical system. Consciousness is not subject to the Schrödinger equation. Consciousness is the thing that lies outside the quantum mechanical description of the physical world, the thing that performs the measurement, that selects the actuality, that causes the collapse that the mathematics cannot explain. Consciousness is the observer. The implications for the identity question are immediate. If consciousness is the observer, if consciousness is the thing that collapses the wave function, that selects actuality from potentiality, that lies outside the quantum description of the physical world, then consciousness is not a physical process. It is not a brain state. It is not a neural computation. It is not the narrative self that the DMN generates or the confabulation that the left hemisphere interpreter produces. It is something else, something that is not described by the physics that describes everything else. something that lies at the boundary of the physical world, something that interacts with the physical world through the act of measurement. But that is not itself part of the physical world that it measures. This is a radical claim, and it has been resisted by physicists for a century, not because it is logically incoherent, but because it violates the materialist assumption that everything, including consciousness, is a physical process describable by physical laws. The resistance has produced a proliferation of alternative interpretations of quantum mechanics. The many worlds interpretation, no collapse occurs. Instead, the universe splits into branches. The decoherence interpretation, collapse, is an illusion produced by the interaction of the quantum system with its environment. The consistent histories interpretation, collapse, is a feature of how we describe events rather than a feature of reality and others. Each interpretation attempts to avoid the conclusion that consciousness plays a special role in physics, and none has succeeded in the sense that none has been experimentally confirmed to the exclusion of the others, and the measurement problem remains unsolved. Eugene Wigner, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and one of the founders of quantum mechanics, pushed von Neumann's reasoning to its logical extreme with a thought experiment now known as Wigner's friend. The thought experiment is this: Wigner's friend performs a quantum measurement inside a closed laboratory. The friend observes the result, the wave function collapses for the friend, and the friend experiences a definite outcome. But Wigner, standing outside the laboratory, has not observed the result. For Wigner, the entire laboratory, including his friend, remains in a superposition. The friend is in a superposition of having observed outcome A and having observed outcome B. The friend's consciousness has collapsed the wave function from the friend's perspective. But from Wigner's perspective, the friend's consciousness has not collapsed anything because Wigner has not observed the friend's observation, and the superposition persists until Wigner observes. The paradox is this: has the wave function collapsed or not? The answer depends on who is asking. For the friend, it has collapsed. For Wigner, it has not. Reality, the definite, objective, observer-independent reality that classical physics assumes does not exist in quantum mechanics. Reality is observer-dependent. What is definite for one observer may be indefinite for another. The thought experiment remained theoretical for decades, a philosopher's puzzle, interesting but untestable. But in 2019, a team led by Massimiliano Proietti at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh performed a physical experiment based on an extended version of the Wigner's friend scenario, and the results confirmed the paradox. The experiment demonstrated that two observers can, in fact, obtain results that are mutually inconsistent, results that cannot be reconciled within a single, objective, observer-independent description of reality. The experiment did not prove that consciousness collapses the wave function, but it did prove that the assumption of a single, objective reality, a reality that is the same for all observers, regardless of their perspective, is inconsistent with the predictions of quantum mechanics. Reality is not objective. Reality is perspectival, and the perspective, the specific self, from which reality is observed, determines what reality looks like, and the self, the specific observational perspective from which reality is experienced, is not a passive witness to an objective reality. It is a constitutive element of reality, the perspective from which one version of reality becomes definite, while other versions remain potential. This connects directly to the identity question. If reality is observer-dependent, if what is real depends on who is observing, then the who is not a trivial detail. The who is a fundamental feature of reality. The self is not a passenger in a universe that exists independently of it. The self is a perspective, a specific observational vantage point from which a specific version of reality is actualized. And the question, "Who am I?" is not merely a psychological question about identity. It is a physical question about the nature of reality, because the answer determines which version of reality is experienced, which possibilities are collapsed into actualities, and which universe the observer inhabits. Henry Stapp's interpretation of quantum mechanics makes this explicit. In Stapp's framework, consciousness interacts with the brain through process 1, the choice of which quantum template to attend to. The brain generates a superposition of possible neural states, a quantum menu of templates, each representing a different thought, a different perception, a different intention. And consciousness through process 1 selects one template from the superposition, collapsing it into a definite neural state. The selection is the moment of conscious experience. The selection is the moment of identity. The selection is the I, not the narrative I of the DMN, not the confabulating I of the left hemisphere interpreter, but the observing I that selects from the superposition, that collapses the wave function, that brings a specific experience into actuality from the field of all possible experiences. But notice what Stapp's framework implies about the relationship between the observer and the observed. The observer consciousness selects the template becomes the thought is experienced by the observer, but the observer is not the thought. The observer is the selector of the thought. The observer precedes the thought logically, if not temporally. The thought is the product of the selection. The observer is the agent of the selection. And the agent and the product are not the same thing, just as the voter and the elected official are not the same thing. Just as the reader and the book are not the same thing. Just as the awareness and the thought are not the same thing. This is the quantum formulation of the insight that the contemplative traditions have been articulating for millennia. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that selects, observes, and experiences your thoughts. The thoughts are the products of process 1. You are the agent of process 1. Stapp has been explicit about the identity implications of his framework. In his book Mindful Universe, Stapp argues that quantum mechanics brings the human agent back into the causal structure of nature, not as a passive observer of a pre-existing reality, but as an active participant in the creation of reality through the process of conscious observation. The I that participates in reality's creation is not the narrative self, not the story that the DMN tells, not the confabulation that the left hemisphere interpreter produces. It is the attending consciousness, the awareness that directs attention, that selects the template, that performs the quantum measurement, that collapses the superposition. And this attending consciousness is, in Stapp's framework, not produced by the brain. It acts upon the brain from outside the quantum mechanical description of the brain's physical processes, selecting from the brain's quantum superposition the specific neural state that becomes the next moment of experience. The attending consciousness is prior to the thought logically, if not temporally. The thought is the output, the attending consciousness is the input, and the I that you normally identify with the thought, the narrative, the internal monologue, is the output, not the input. You have been identifying with the product when you are actually the producer. You have been identifying with the movie when you are actually the screen. You have been identifying with the collapse when you are actually the observer that causes the collapse. And the distinction between the agent and the products, between the observer and the observed, between the awareness and the thoughts, is not a philosophical subtlety. It is a feature of quantum mechanics, a consequence of the measurement problem, a logical implication of the role that consciousness plays in the collapse of the wave function. David Bohm's implicate order dissolves the identity question from yet another angle, and the dissolution is perhaps more radical than either the neuroscience or the standard quantum framework provides. In Bohm's framework, the fundamental reality is not particles, not fields, not observers. It is the undivided wholeness of the implicate order. The division between observer and observed, between the I that watches and the world that is watched, is a feature of the explicate order, the surface reality of distinct objects and separate selves. In the implicate order, there is no division. There is no observer separate from the observed. There is no self separate from the world. There is only the undivided flow of reality, the hollow movement, as Bohm called it, in which the distinctions between self and other, between inner and outer, between subject and object are revealed as projections from a deeper unity that contains them both. The identity question, who am I, assumes that there is an I that is separate from the reality it inhabits. Bohm's framework challenges this assumption at its root. The I is not separate. The I is a fold in the hollow movement, a temporary, local, explicate order pattern in the continuous flow of the implicate order. The fold has a perspective. The fold has an experience. The fold has a sense of being an individual separate from other folds, separate from the hollow movement itself. But the separation is apparent, not real. The fold is the flow. The wave is the ocean. The individual is the totality experiencing itself from a specific vantage point. Bohm illustrated this with an analogy that illuminates the identity question with extraordinary clarity. Imagine a fish tank with a single fish, filmed by two cameras at right angles, one filming the front of the tank, one filming the side. The two camera feeds are displayed on two separate screens in another room. A viewer watching the two screens sees what appears to be two different fish, one on each screen, moving independently, each with its own behavior. But the movements are correlated. When one fish turns left, the other turns to face forward, simultaneously, without any signal passing between them. The correlation is mysterious. It appears to involve instantaneous communication between two separate entities. But the mystery dissolves when you realize that there is only one fish. The two screens are showing two perspectives on the same fish. The apparent separateness is an artifact of the projection. The apparent correlation is a consequence of the underlying unity. And the identity of each screen fish, its position, its movement, its apparent independence, is not a property of the fish. It is a property of the perspective. Bohm's point is that the relationship between individuals in the explicate order is analogous to the relationship between the screen fish. We appear to be separate selves, separate observers, separate identities, separate eyes, inhabiting separate bodies. But the appearance may be a projection, a consequence of the explicate order's fragmented perspective on an implicate reality that is undivided. In the implicate order, there is only one fish, one consciousness, one awareness, one undivided hollow movement that appears as many selves when projected through the explicate order's fragmenting lens, and the question, who am I, resolves not into a specific answer, not into I am this self, or I am this narrative, or I am this body, but into the recognition that the questioner and the question and the answer are all expressions of the same undivided reality. The filter theory of consciousness, which we developed in the OBE investigation and extended in the creativity investigation, provides the most direct connection between the quantum framework and the identity question. If the brain filters consciousness rather than producing it, if consciousness is a non-local field that the brain constrains to a body-centered, survival-optimized focus, Then, the I is the filter. The narrative self, the DMN-generated story of who you are, where you came from, what you want, and where you are going, is the filter's output. It is the constrained, narrowed, localized version of a consciousness that is, in its unfiltered state, non-local, unbounded, and not identified with any particular body, any particular narrative, or any particular self. William James, the founder of American psychology, proposed this view in 1898. The brain's function is transmissive, not productive. The brain transmits consciousness as a prism transmits light, allowing certain aspects through while filtering others. Aldous Huxley elaborated the view in 1954. The brain is a reducing valve, a mechanism that limits the totality of consciousness to the trickle that is useful for biological survival. And the I, the narrative self, the ego, the specific identity that you experience as uniquely and exclusively yours, is the shape of the valve's opening. The I is the specific configuration of the filter, the particular set of constraints, narrowings, and reductions that produces this particular perspective, this particular set of memories, this particular personality, this particular sense of being this person, and not some other person. Change the configuration, and you change the I, as dissociative identity disorder demonstrates, as brain damage demonstrates, as the contemplative practices that dissolve the ego demonstrate. When the filter is relaxed through meditation, through psychedelics, through near-death, the I dissolves. But consciousness does not dissolve, it expands. The Carhart-Harris finding is the empirical confirmation. Less DMN activity produces more consciousness, not less. The I was not producing the consciousness. The I was constraining the consciousness. And when the constraint is removed, when the filter thins, when the DMN quiets, when the narrative self falls silent, consciousness returns to its natural state, wide, open, unbounded, not identified with any particular perspective, not confined to any particular narrative, not limited to any particular self. This is what the psilocybin participants report. This is what the experienced meditators report. This is what the near-death experiencers report. The I dissolves, and what remains is not nothing. It is everything, a vast, luminous, unbounded awareness that the participants describe as more real than real, as the most real thing I have ever experienced, as the ground from which everything arises. The Hindus call it Brahman. The Buddhists call it sunyata, emptiness that is simultaneously fullness. The Christians call it the divine ground. The Sufis call it al-Hallaj, the real. The names are different. The experience is the same, and the experience is the dissolution of the filter, the temporary removal of the I that constrains consciousness, revealing the consciousness that was always there, beneath the I, wider than the I, deeper than the I, and fundamentally different from the I in every respect except one. It is aware. The quantum Zeno effect adds a mechanism for understanding how the I is maintained and how it can be dissolved. The Zeno effect, as we have explored in multiple investigations, is the quantum principle that sustained observation stabilizes a quantum state, preventing it from evolving into other states, holding it in place against the natural tendency to decohere. The I may be a Zeno-stabilized state, a narrative pattern that is maintained by the continuous self-referential attention of the DMN. The DMN constantly observes the I, constantly narrates, constantly references, constantly reinforces the pattern of self-identification that constitutes the narrative self, and the constant observation stabilizes the pattern, preventing it from dissolving, preventing it from evolving into a wider, more fluid, less bounded state of awareness. Meditation disrupts the xenostabilization. By redirecting attention from the self-referential narrative to a neutral object, the breath, a mantra, a visualization meditation withdraws the xeno-observation from the I. The DMN's self-referential activity decreases. The narrative self is no longer being observed with the intensity that was stabilizing it, and the I begins to dissolve, not because it is being destroyed, but because it is no longer being maintained. The I is not a permanent structure. It is a xeno-stabilized pattern, maintained by continuous observation, dissolved by the withdrawal of observation. The xeno mechanism explains why the I feels so solid, so real, so permanent, even though the neuroscience demonstrates that it is a construction. A xeno-stabilized state feels fixed. It resists change. It returns to its baseline after perturbation. The I has these properties. It feels fixed, the sense of continuous identity across time. It resists change. The ego's defense mechanisms that protect the narrative from threatening information, and it returns to its baseline after perturbation. The I reassembles after psychedelic experiences, after meditation retreats, after near-death experiences, more flexible, perhaps, but still recognizable as the same general pattern. The stability is real, but it is maintained stability, not inherent stability. The I is not a rock. It is a standing wave, a pattern that persists because the conditions that maintain it persist, and that dissolves when the conditions are removed. Meditation research confirms this mechanism. Brewer's real-time fMRI studies show that the DMN's self-referential activity decreases during meditation, and that the decrease is progressive. Novice meditators show small, temporary decreases. Experienced meditators show large, sustained decreases. And the most experienced meditators, Davidson's 10,000-hour practitioners, show permanently reduced DMN baseline activity, even when they are not meditating. The xeno observation has been progressively withdrawn. The standing wave has been progressively reduced, and the consciousness that was being constrained by the wave has been progressively liberated, producing the sustained gamma oscillations, the expanded awareness, and the reduced self-referential processing that Davidson documented as the neural signature of contemplative expertise. And the consciousness that remains when the pattern dissolves is not a new consciousness. It is the consciousness that was always there, the consciousness that was being constrained by the pattern, that was being filtered by the I, that was being narrowed by the xeno-stabilized narrative self into the thin beam of body-centered, ego-identified, self-referential awareness that you normally experience as being you. The implications are profound. The I is not fundamental. It is maintained. It is not permanent. It is stabilized. It is not essential. It is constructed, and the construction can be deconstructed through the practices that the traditions prescribe and that the neuroscience confirms, not to destroy the self, not to annihilate the person, but to see through the self, to recognize the construction as a construction, to perceive the filter as a filter, to experience the consciousness that the filter constrains as wider, deeper, and more fundamental than the filter that constrains it. The next part of this investigation will enter the traditions, fully hearing their precise, detailed, practice-tested descriptions of what lies beyond the I, because the traditions did not merely assert that the self is a construction. They provided technologies for deconstructing its systematic, reproducible, empirically refined practices for dissolving the narrative self and experiencing the awareness that remains. And the descriptions of what they found across every culture, every century, every tradition are so consistent, so structurally aligned, and so resonant with the quantum framework we have assembled that they constitute, in their convergence, something close to a map of the territory that lies beyond the boundary of the self. The traditions did not merely assert that you are not your thoughts. They proved it through direct experience, through centuries of systematic investigation, through the sustained, disciplined observation of the mind's own activity conducted by practitioners who devoted their entire lives to the question that the neuroscience and the quantum physics have now raised with unavoidable urgency. If the narrative self is a construction, if the I is a xeno-stabilized pattern maintained by the DMN's continuous self-referential processing, if the observer is prior to the observed and the awareness is deeper than the thoughts, then what are you? What remains when the construction is deconstructed? What is there when the I is gone? The traditions answer, and their answers developed independently, across cultures that had no contact with each other, refined through millennia of practice, tested against the direct experience of millions of practitioners, converge on a description so consistent, so structurally precise, and so resonant with the quantum framework we have assembled, that the convergence itself constitutes a form of evidence. Not scientific proof, but convergent testimony, the independent reports of explorers who have visited the same territory and who have drawn, without collaboration, the same map. Buddhism provides the most rigorous analytical framework for deconstructing the self, and the deconstruction begins with a question that the monk Nagasena posed to King Milinda over 2,000 years ago. The king asks, "What is your name, venerable sir?" Nagasena replies, "I am known as Nagasena." But Nagasena is merely a name, a designation, a label. There is no permanent self to be found here. The king is puzzled. He looks at the monk and sees a body, a robe, a face. Surely these constitute a person, a self, a Nagasena. Nagasena responds with an analogy that has echoed through 25 centuries of Buddhist philosophy. "Your Majesty, you came here in a chariot. Tell me, is the pole the chariot?" "No, venerable sir." "Are the wheels the chariot?" "No." "Is the axle the chariot?" "No." "Is the body of the chariot the chariot?" "No." "Is the yoke the chariot?" "No." Then is the chariot something apart from the pole, the wheels, the axle, the body, and the yoke? "No, venerable sir." "Then, your Majesty, I can find no chariot. The chariot is merely a name, a designation, a label applied to the collection of parts. In the same way, Nagasena is merely a name applied to the collection of components, the body, the feelings, the perceptions, the mental formations, the consciousness. But there is no permanent self, no Nagasena to be found among them. The 5 components that Nagasena identifies, body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, are the 5 skandhas, the 5 aggregates that constitute the totality of human experience in the Buddhist analysis. The Buddhist claim is not that you do not exist. It is that you do not exist in the way you think you exist. You exist as a process, a dynamic, continuously changing, causally connected flow of bodily sensations, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and moments of consciousness that arise and pass away in rapid succession, each giving rise to the next, none persisting, none permanent, none constituting a fixed, unchanging, essential self. The practice of vipassana insight meditation is the Buddhist technology for verifying this analysis through direct experience rather than intellectual assent. The vipassana practitioner sits in silence and observes, not the content of thoughts, not what the thoughts are about, but the process of thinking itself. The arising of a thought, the persisting of a thought, the passing away of a thought, and the gap between thoughts, the moment of clear, empty, luminous awareness that exists between the dissolution of one thought and the arising of the next. The observation is sustained for hours, days, weeks. In intensive retreat, the format in which vipassana is traditionally practiced, the practitioner meditates for 10 to 16 hours per day in silence, without reading, without writing, without speaking, without any external stimulation. The only activity is observation, and the observation progressively reveals what the analytical mind cannot perceive: the impermanence of every mental event. The thoughts do not last, the feelings do not last, the sensations do not last, the perceptions do not last. Everything that arises in consciousness passes away quickly, continuously, without exception. And the I that seems so solid, so permanent, so real, is revealed through sustained observation to be a pattern, a rapidly shifting, continuously reconstructed, moment-to-moment pattern of mental events that creates the illusion of continuity through the same mechanism that a movie creates the illusion of motion. Rapid succession of discrete frames, each slightly different from the last, projected so quickly that the gaps between them are imperceptible. The Burmese master Mahasi Sayadaw, whose vipassana methodology is the most widely practiced insight meditation technique in the world, described the progression of insight through a series of stages called the knowledges. As the practice deepens, the meditator passes through specific, predictable, reproducible stages of insight, each revealing a deeper layer of the self's constructed nature. The early stages reveal the impermanence of sensory experience, the constant arising and passing of bodily sensations. The middle stages reveal the impermanence of the observer itself, the shocking discovery that the I that is observing the sensations is itself changing, moment by moment, not the fixed witness that it appeared to be. And the advanced stages, the stages that the tradition describes as approaching nibbana, involve the direct, experiential encounter with what the tradition calls the cessation of perception and feeling, a moment in which all mental activity ceases, all content disappears, all construction stops, and consciousness encounters its own ground, empty, luminous, unconditioned, free. The cessation experience is not unconsciousness, it is not sleep, it is not a blank. Practitioners who have experienced it describe it with remarkable consistency, a gap, a discontinuity, a moment in which the entire apparatus of the self, the thoughts, the feelings, the perceptions, the I that observes them stops. The cessation is not sought through effort, it is not produced by concentration. It arises naturally, spontaneously, when the meditator's observation has reached a sufficient depth and the insight into impermanence has become sufficiently thorough. The practitioner does not do the cessation. The cessation happens when the conditions are right, when the investigation has been complete, when every layer of the constructed self has been observed, understood, and released. The cessation is not an achievement. It is a recognition, the recognition of what was always already the case. Thousands of practitioners in the Mahasi tradition have reported the cessation experience, and their reports are consistent enough to constitute a reproducible finding. The consistency is remarkable given the diversity of the practitioners, monks and lay people, men and women, young and old, from dozens of countries and cultural backgrounds. The experience is not culturally determined. It is not produced by expectation or suggestion. Practitioners who have never read about the cessation and who have no conceptual framework for understanding it report the same structural features. The gap, the discontinuity, the moment of total cessation, followed by the recognition that consciousness was present throughout, present not as a content, but as a ground, not as an experience, but as the space in which experience occurs, and in the stopping, something is revealed, not a thing, not a perception, not an experience in the ordinary sense. A recognition, the recognition that consciousness was always there, beneath the activity, beneath the construction, beneath the I as the ground from which all mental activity arises and into which all mental activity returns. The recognition changes everything. After the cessation, the meditator does not lose the capacity for thinking, feeling, or perceiving, but the relationship to these activities is transformed. The meditator no longer identifies with them. The thoughts arise, but the meditator knows not intellectually but experientially, not as a belief but as a direct perception that the thoughts are not the self. The self was the awareness in which the thoughts appeared, and the awareness is still there, unchanged, undamaged, undiminished, after the thoughts have stopped and after they have resumed. Hinduism approaches the identity question through a practice that is the mirror image of vipassana's analytical deconstruction, where vipassana dissolves the self by observing its components until their impermanence is directly perceived. The Hindu practice of atma-vichara, self-inquiry, dissolves the self by asking a single question with relentless persistence: who am I? The practice was most famously taught by Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century Indian sage, who is widely regarded as the most important Hindu teacher of the modern era. Ramana's method is deceptively simple. Whenever a thought arises, ask, to whom does this thought occur? The answer is always, to me. Then ask, who am I? And pursue the question not intellectually, not by constructing philosophical answers, but by turning attention inward, toward the source of the I, toward the place from which the sense of self arises. The inquiry proceeds by negation, the method that the Upanishads call neti-neti, not this, not this. Am I my body? No, because I can observe my body. The observer is not the observed. Am I my thoughts? No, because I can observe my thoughts. Am I my emotions? No, because I can observe my emotions. Am I my memories? No, because I can observe my memories. Everything that can be observed is not the observer. Everything that can be known is not the knower. And the I, the real I, the I that is doing the observing, the I that remains when every object of observation has been negated, is not an object. It is not a thing. It is not a content of consciousness. It is consciousness itself, the pure, contentless, self-luminous awareness that is present in every experience but that is identical to no experience. The practice is not intellectual. Ramana was emphatic about this. Vichara is not philosophical reasoning. It is not the construction of logical arguments about the nature of the self. It is the direct turning of attention toward its own source, the attempt to catch the I in the act of arising, to observe the moment when the sense of self first appears, to find the place from which the I thought emerges. And the consistent report of practitioners who have pursued the inquiry with sufficient persistence is that the I thought cannot be found. When you look for it, when you turn attention toward the source of the I dissolves. It exists only in its pointing, only in its outward direction toward objects and thoughts and the world. When attention turns inward, toward the pointer itself, the pointer disappears. And what remains, what was always there, behind the pointer, beneath the pointing, prior to every outward directed thought, is the awareness that Ramana calls the self with a capital S. Not the personal self, not the narrative self, not the ego, but the absolute awareness that is the ground of all experience, and that is, in Ramana's teaching, identical with Brahman. Ramana's teaching has been studied by Western psychologists and neuroscientists, and the structural parallels to the neuroscience are striking. The I thought, the thought, I am, that Ramana identifies as the root of all other thoughts, corresponds to the DMN's self-referential processing. The dissolution of the I thought through self-inquiry corresponds to the reduction in DMN activity that meditation produces. And the awareness that remains when the I thought dissolves corresponds to the consciousness that Brewer's meditators described as full rather than empty when their DMN went quiet. Ramana did not know about the default mode network, but he described its activity and its cessation with a precision that neuroscience has only recently been able to match. Ramana described the discovery in language that maps directly onto the neuroscience and the quantum framework. The mind is merely a bundle of thoughts. The thoughts have their root in the I thought. Whoever investigates the I thought through self-inquiry realizes that it has no independent existence. When the I thought dissolves, the self shines forth on its own. The I thought, the DMN's narrative self, the left hemisphere interpreter's confabulation, the xeno-stabilized pattern of self-referential processing dissolves when investigated directly. And what remains, what shines forth on its own, is not a new self. It is the awareness that was always there, concealed by the I thought's continuous activity, revealed when the activity ceases. Shankara, the 8th century philosopher who systematized Advaita Vedanta into the most rigorous non-dual philosophical system in any tradition, formulated the insight in a single sentence that compresses the entire investigation into 7 Sanskrit words: Brahman Satyam, Jagan Mithya, Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. Brahman, the Absolute, the ground of reality, the pure consciousness that underlies all phenomena, is real. Jagat, the world, the manifest universe, the explicate order of distinct objects and separate selves, is mithya, appearance, not independently real. And Jiva, the individual self, the I, the specific identity that you experience as uniquely yours, is not separate from Brahman. The individual consciousness is the universal consciousness, experienced from a specific perspective, constrained by a specific filter, narrowed by a specific configuration of the reducing valve. The I is not other than Brahman. The wave is not other than the ocean. The fold is not other than the hollow movement. And the recognition of this identity, the direct experiential realization that the individual self and the universal ground are not two things but one thing perceived from two perspectives, is moksha, liberation, the end of the search for identity, because the identity has been found. You are everything. Christianity approaches the identity question through the tradition of mystical prayer, and the greatest Christian mystics describe an experience that is structurally identical to the Hindu and Buddhist accounts. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Dominican theologian, whose sermons are among the most radical mystical texts in any tradition, describes the dissolution of the self in terms that echo Ramana's self-inquiry and the Buddhist cessation experience with uncanny precision. The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. Eckhart writes, "My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." The statement collapses the distinction between the observer and the observed, between the self and God, between the individual consciousness and the divine ground. Eckhart is not speaking metaphorically. He is describing a direct experience, an experience that he repeatedly describes as Gelassenheit, releasement or letting go, in which the I, the ego, the narrative self, the constructed identity is released, abandoned, surrendered. And in the release, what remains is not emptiness. It is God, not the God of theology, not the God of doctrine, not the God that is an object of belief, but the God that is the ground of all experience, the awareness that is present in every perception, the isness that Eckhart identifies as the divine nature. Eckhart's concept of Gelassenheit, the letting go of the self, is structurally identical to the xeno-destabilization that the quantum framework describes. The I is maintained by holding on by the continuous self-referential attention that stabilizes the narrative pattern. Gelassenheit is letting go, withdrawing the xeno-attention, releasing the grip, allowing the pattern to dissolve. And what remains when the pattern dissolves is what Eckhart calls the Gottheit, the Godhead, the divine ground that is deeper than God, that is prior to God, that is the absolute from which even the divine Trinity emerges. The Gottheit is Brahman, the Gottheit is Sunyata. The Gottheit is the awareness that remains when every construction, including the construction of God as an object, has been released. Eckhart's language is deliberately paradoxical, and the paradoxes serve a function that is identical to the function of the Zen koan. God is nothing, Eckhart writes, not because God does not exist, but because God is not a thing, not an object, not a being among beings, not an entity that can be grasped by the conceptual mind. God is the no thing from which all things arise, the emptiness that is simultaneously the fullness, the darkness that is simultaneously the light, the unknowing that is simultaneously the deepest knowing. The paradox is not a failure of language. It is the only language adequate to the experience because the experience transcends the categories that ordinary language employs. Eckhart was condemned by the papal court not for being wrong but for being too radical, too direct, too willing to describe the mystical experience in terms that threatened the institutional church's role as mediator between the soul and God. If the eye through which you see God is the same eye through which God sees you, if the seeing is one seeing, not two, then the priest, the sacrament, the institution are unnecessary. The soul has direct access to the divine ground. The awareness that remains when the ego dissolves is the divine awareness itself. And the entire apparatus of institutional religion, with its hierarchies, its doctrines, its gatekeeping, is revealed as a construction that conceals rather than reveals the direct encounter between consciousness and its own ground. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, through the practice of hesychasm that we have encountered in multiple investigations, arrived at the same insight through different language. Gregory Palamas, the 14th century Athonite monk, distinguished between God's essence, ousia, which is forever unknowable, and God's energies, energiae, which can be directly experienced. The hesychast who practices the Jesus prayer with sufficient depth and persistence encounters the uncreated light, a luminous awareness that is not produced by the brain, not generated by the senses, not constructed by the imagination, but directly perceived by the purified nous, the spiritual intellect that is deeper than the discursive mind. The uncreated light is the Christian equivalent of the clear light of the Tibetan tradition, the luminosity of the Hindu tradition, and the emptiness that is luminosity of the Buddhist tradition. Different names, same experience, same awareness, same ground. The anonymous 14th century English mystic who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing describes the practice that produces this release. The cloud instructs the contemplative to place all thoughts, all concepts, all images, all ideas, even the idea of God, beneath a cloud of forgetting. Not to fight the thoughts, not to suppress them, simply to let them pass, to place them gently beneath the cloud and to remain in the darkness above the cloud, in the naked awareness that has no object, no content, no thought to cling to. The practice is structurally identical to vipassana, the sustained observation of thoughts arising and passing, without engagement, without identification, without the xeno-stabilization that identification produces. And the result is structurally identical: the dissolution of the constructed self, the emergence of a naked awareness that the cloud's author describes as the encounter with God in darkness, in unknowing, in the absence of everything that the mind can grasp. The Islamic tradition, through its Sufi dimension, describes the same journey with a vocabulary and a precision that rival the Hindu and Buddhist accounts. The Sufi path is mapped through a series of stations, maqamat, that describe the progressive dissolution of the ego and the progressive revelation of the divine identity that the ego conceals. The station of Tawbah, repentance, is the beginning, the recognition that the ego's habitual patterns are not serving the soul's deepest purpose. The station of sabr, patience, is the cultivation of the capacity to endure the ego's dissolution without resistance. The station of shukr, gratitude, is the shift from the ego's orientation toward lack to the soul's orientation toward abundance. The station of tawakkul, trust, is the surrender of the ego's need to control outcomes. The station of rida, contentment, is the acceptance of whatever reality provides, without the ego's constant comparison and complaint. And the station of fana, annihilation, is the final dissolution of the ego in the divine presence, the moment when the I disappears and what remains is Allah, not as an object of worship, but as the sole reality, the only existence, the awareness that was always present beneath the ego's noise. Al-Hallaj, the 10th century Sufi mystic who was executed for heresy, described the fana experience with a statement that scandalized the Islamic establishment, and that illuminates the identity question with startling directness. Ana al-Haq, I am the real, or I am God. The statement appears to be the ultimate ego inflation, a human being claiming to be God, but al-Hallaj was describing the opposite of ego inflation. He was describing ego annihilation, the state in which the personal I has been completely dissolved and what remains is not al-Hallaj but al-Haq, the real, the divine consciousness that was always present beneath the personal identity. Al-Hallaj is not claiming that his ego is God. He is reporting that his ego has been annihilated, and that what remains, the consciousness that was concealed by the ego, is the divine. The I in Ana al-Haq is not the personal I. It is the divine I, the consciousness that speaks when the personal consciousness has been silenced, the awareness that shines when the ego's noise has been stilled. Ibn Arabi, the greatest metaphysician of the Sufi tradition, developed a philosophical framework for understanding al-Hallaj's experience. Ibn Arabi's concept of wahdat al-wujud, the unity of being, holds that there is only one existence, one reality, one consciousness, God's. Everything that appears to exist independently, every object, every person, every self, is a tajalli, a divine self-disclosure, a specific mode in which the one consciousness manifests itself. The individual I is not a separate existence. It is a mirror, a specific angle of reflection in which the one consciousness perceives itself from a particular perspective. When the mirror is polished, when the ego's distortions are removed, when the heart is purified through the practices of the path, the mirror reflects the divine light without distortion. And the I that is perceived in the polished mirror is not the personal I. It is God's I, the divine consciousness recognizing itself in the mirror of the purified heart. This is a radical non-dualism comparable to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta in its philosophical rigor and its uncompromising insistence on the ultimate identity of the individual consciousness and the divine ground. The The difference is that Ibn Arabi maintains the reality of the individual perspective. The mirror is real. The angle of reflection is real. The specific mode of divine self-disclosure is real, while insisting that the reality reflected in the mirror is not the mirror's own. The individual exists, but the individual's existence is borrowed from the one existence, the one consciousness, the one being that is the only reality. It is the divine I, the consciousness that speaks when the personal consciousness has been silenced, the awareness that shines when the ego's noise has been stilled. Rumi, whose poetry expresses the Sufi path with a beauty and a clarity that have made him the best-selling poet in the English-speaking world, describes the same journey in images that resonate across every cultural boundary. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. The statement is Shankara's Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. In poetic form, the individual is not separate from the totality. The drop is not other than the ocean. The self is not other than the ground. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. The statement is Gelassenheit. In Sufi vocabulary, the practice is not to acquire something new, but to remove the barriers that conceal what was always there. The barriers are the I, the ego, the narrative self, the xeno-stabilized pattern of self-identification that conceals the love, the awareness, the divine ground that was present before the barriers were built and that remains when the barriers are removed. The Taoist tradition adds a perspective that illuminates the identity question from yet another angle, the perspective of naturalness, of spontaneity, of the self that is not constructed but that flows. Zhuangzi's famous butterfly dream captures the Taoist approach to identity with characteristic playfulness. Once upon a time, Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly fluttering about, enjoying itself. It did not know that it was Zhuangzi. Suddenly he awoke, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he did not know whether he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. The dream dissolves the boundary between identities, between Zhuangzi and the butterfly, between the dreamer and the dreamed, between oneself and another, and the dissolution is not a problem. It is a liberation, a release from the fixity of identity, a recognition that the I is fluid rather than fixed, a perspective rather than a substance, a dream rather than a dreamer. The Taoist response to "Who am I?" is not a definitive answer. It is a smile, the smile of one who recognizes that the question assumes a fixity that reality does not possess, that the I is as fluid as the Tao, as changeable as the seasons, as ungraspable as water that takes the shape of whatever vessel contains it. The convergence across traditions is not merely thematic, it is structural, specific, and reproducible. Every tradition identifies the narrative self, the I of thoughts, memories, and self-referential processing, as a construction rather than a given. Every tradition prescribes specific practices for dissolving the construction: vipassana, atma vichara, Gelassenheit, the cloud of unknowing, fana, wu wei. Every tradition reports that the dissolution of the constructed self reveals an awareness that is deeper, wider, and more fundamental than the self it concealed. And every tradition describes this awareness in terms that are structurally identical as unconditioned, as luminous, as empty yet full, as the ground of all experience, as identical with the ultimate reality that the tradition's theology describes. The Aboriginal tradition adds the perspective that identity is not merely individual, but cosmic, that the self is not contained within the boundaries of the person but extends into the landscape, into the dream time, into the web of songlines and stories and ceremonial connections that link the individual to the land, to the ancestors, and to the ongoing creative process of reality itself. In Aboriginal understanding, the question, "Who am I?" cannot be answered by looking inward, because the self is not inside. The self is a relationship, a specific configuration of connections between the individual and the land, between the present and the dream time, between the human and the ancestral beings who sang the world into existence. Identity is not a possession. It is a participation, a role in the cosmic drama, a voice in the cosmic song, a thread in the cosmic web that is not separable from the web without destroying both the thread and the pattern it helps to create. This relational understanding of identity resonates with the quantum framework's description of entanglement, the non-local correlations that connect particles across any distance without signal transmission. If identity is relational rather than substantial, if the self is a pattern of connections rather than a thing, then the quantum description of reality as a web of correlations rather than a collection of objects applies to the self as well as to the physical world. The self is not a particle. It is an entanglement, a specific configuration of informational correlations that constitutes a perspective, a viewpoint, a mode of experience. And the perspective is real, but the perspective is not the reality. The reality is the web. The perspective is one node in the web connected to every other node, defined by its connections rather than by its isolation, meaningful only in relation to the totality from which it cannot be separated. The final part of this investigation will put it all together: the neuroscience, the quantum physics, the traditions, and address the question that has been building since the first sentence of this investigation. If you are not your thoughts, then what are you? And the answer from the science and the traditions alike may be the most liberating thing you have ever heard. 3 investigations, 3 independent approaches to the question that Descartes placed at the foundation of Western philosophy: I think, therefore I am, and 3 convergent responses that invert his conclusion. You think, yes, but the I that you attribute the thinking to the author, the decider, the narrator, the self, is not what you think it is. The neuroscience demonstrates that the I is a construction, a post hoc narrative generated by the default mode network, a confabulation produced by the left hemisphere interpreter, a xeno-stabilized pattern maintained by continuous, self-referential attention. The quantum physics demonstrates that the observer is prior to the observed, that consciousness is not produced by neural activity, but is the agent that selects from neural superpositions, that the I of the narrative self is the product of process 1, while the consciousness that performs process 1 is the producer. And the traditions demonstrate, through millennia of contemplative practice, that the dissolution of the narrative self reveals an awareness that is deeper, wider, and more fundamental than the self it was concealing, an awareness that every tradition describes with structural consistency as unconditioned, luminous, and identical with the ground of reality. Descartes was half right. Thinking happens, being happens. But the therefore, the logical connector that links thinking to being, that identifies the thinker with the thought, that equates consciousness with the narrative self, is the error. The thinking and the being are not the same thing. The thinking is the content, the being is the context. The thinking comes and goes, the being remains. And the I, the Cartesian I, that is supposed to be the bridge between thinking and being, is a construction that obscures the distinction rather than revealing it. The neuroscience established the construction, Libet showed that decisions are made before conscious awareness. Haynes extended the predictive window to 7 to 10 seconds. Gazzaniga showed that the left hemisphere confabulates explanations for behaviors it did not initiate. Nisbett and Wilson showed that people systematically cannot identify the actual reasons for their decisions. Killingsworth and Gilbert showed that the narrative self, the DMN's continuous self-referential processing, is associated with unhappiness. Brewer showed that silencing the narrative self through meditation produces not emptiness but fullness, a deeper, richer, more present awareness. Carhart-Harris showed that chemically suppressing the DMN with psilocybin produces the most meaningful experiences of participants' lives, and the dissociative identity research showed that multiple eyes can inhabit the same brain, demonstrating that identity is a software configuration, not a hardware feature. The quantum physics established the depth. Von Neumann showed that the measurement chain terminates at consciousness, that the observer is not part of the physical system it observes. Wigner showed that reality is observer-dependent, that what is real depends on who is looking. Proietti's 2019 experiment confirmed this, experimentally demonstrating that two observers can obtain mutually inconsistent results, proving that a single, objective, observer-independent reality does not exist in quantum mechanics. Stapp showed that consciousness interacts with the brain through process 1, the selection of a template from a superposition, and that the selecting consciousness is prior to the selected thought. Bohm showed that the separation between observer and observed is a feature of the explicate order, and that in the implicate order, the distinction dissolves into an undivided wholeness. And the filter theory showed that the I may be not the producer of consciousness, but its filter the specific configuration of constraints that narrows a non-local, unbounded awareness into the thin beam of body-centered, ego-identified experience that you call being you. The traditions established the territory beyond the self. Buddhism's vipassana revealed that sustained observation of mental activity produces the direct perception of impermanence, and that the cessation of all mental activity reveals the awareness that was always present beneath the activity. Hinduism's Atma Vichara revealed that the I thought dissolves when investigated directly, and that what remains is the pure awareness that Ramana called the self. Christianity's Gelassenheit revealed that letting go of the self opens the space in which the divine ground is perceived, the one I, one seeing, one knowing, one love that Eckhart described. Islam's fana revealed that the annihilation of the ego reveals the divine consciousness that was concealed beneath it, the ana al-Haq that al-Hallaj proclaimed. And every tradition without exception, across every culture and every century, reported that the awareness beyond the self is not empty, it is full, it is luminous, it is the most real thing the practitioner has ever encountered, and it is described with structural consistency across independent traditions as identical with the ground of reality, with Brahman, with Sunyata, with the Godhead, with al-Haq, with the Tao. Now let us confront the objections with the honesty they deserve. The first objection is the evolutionary objection. The self is not a construction in the pejorative sense. It is a construction in the functional sense. The narrative self evolved because it serves the organism's survival. The capacity to generate a continuous, coherent, autobiographical narrative, to remember the past, to anticipate the future, to maintain a stable identity across time, is an adaptive advantage. Organisms with a sense of self can plan, can cooperate, can maintain social relationships, can learn from experience and apply the learning to future situations. The self is not a bug. It is a feature one of the most sophisticated and most successful features that evolution has produced, and the tradition's recommendation to dissolve the self is not liberation. It is regression, a return to a pre-egoic state that evolution has already transcended, a dissolution of the very capacity that makes human civilization possible. This objection is partially valid. The narrative self is functional. It serves the organism's survival. It enables planning, cooperation, and social coordination. And the complete, permanent dissolution of the self, if such a thing were possible, would render the individual unable to function in the world. The traditions recognize this. No tradition recommends the permanent destruction of the ego. Buddhism's anatta is not the annihilation of personhood. It is the recognition that personhood is a process rather than a substance, a construction rather than a given, a useful tool rather than an essential identity. Hinduism's Atman is not the destruction of the individual. It is the recognition that the individual is a wave on an ocean, real as a wave, but not separate from the ocean. Christianity's Gelassenheit is not the elimination of the person. It is the letting go of the person's claim to absolute autonomy. The recognition that the person exists in and through the divine ground, rather than independently of it. The traditions do not recommend ego destruction. They recommend ego transparency, the capacity to use the self without being imprisoned by it, to generate the narrative without believing the narrative is the whole truth, to maintain the functional I, while recognizing that the functional I is a tool rather than an identity. The analogy is a window. A dirty window obscures the view you see, the smudges, the streaks, the accumulated grime, and you mistake the window for the view. A clean window is transparent, you see through it without seeing it, and the view is unobstructed. The tradition's practices are window cleaning, not window destroying. The window remains, the function remains, but the transparency transforms the experience from mistaking the window for the view to seeing through the window to the reality beyond it. The difference between the opaque self and the transparent self is not the difference between having a self and not having a self. It is the difference between being trapped in the self and being free within the self. The person with an opaque self, the person who believes that the narrative is the truth, that the confabulation is reality, that the I is fundamental, is imprisoned. Every threat to the narrative produces anxiety. Every challenge to the identity produces defensive aggression. Every change in circumstances produces the suffering that the Buddhist tradition calls dukkha, the chronic dissatisfaction of a constructed self, trying to maintain its construction against the impermanence that constantly threatens to dissolve it. The person with a transparent self, the person who uses the narrative without believing it, who maintains the I without mistaking it for the awareness, is free. Threats to the narrative do not produce anxiety because the person knows the narrative is a construction and can be reconstructed. Challenges to the identity do not produce defensive aggression because the person knows the identity is a tool and can be modified. Changes in circumstances do not produce chronic suffering because the person knows that the awareness, the ground, the screen, the silence does not change when the circumstances change. The transparent self is not a diminished self. It is a liberated self, a self that has the same functions, the same capacities, the same social abilities as the opaque self, but that operates without the chronic anxiety, the chronic defensiveness, and the chronic suffering that the opaque self's identification with its own constructions inevitably produces. This is what the traditions mean by liberation, not the destruction of the person, the transparency of the person, not the elimination of the self, the seeing through of the self, not the cessation of experience. The transformation of the experiencer from one who is trapped in the content to one who rests in the awareness, from one who is the movie to one who is the screen, from one who is the thought to one who is the silence. The second objection is the neural reduction objection. The experiences that the traditions describe the cessation, the clear light, the divine ground, the awareness beyond the self, are neural events. They are produced by specific brain states, reduced DMN activity, enhanced gamma coherence, altered thalamic gating. The experiences are real in the sense that they are genuine subjective events that the practitioners genuinely undergo, but they are not revelations of a deeper reality. They are brain states, unusual brain states, perhaps profound brain states, but brain states nonetheless, produced by the same neural machinery that produces ordinary waking consciousness, and no more true or fundamental than the ordinary consciousness they temporarily replace. This objection is the materialist's strongest card, and it must be given full weight. The neural correlates of contemplative experience are real. The DMN does decrease during meditation. The gamma coherence does increase. The thalamic gating does change. And the experiences correlate with specific brain states. But the objection assumes what it needs to prove, that the brain states produce the experiences. The correlation between brain states and experiences is established. The direction of causation is not. The materialist assumes brain state causes experience. The filter theory proposes brain state constrains experience. The two assumptions produce identical predictions about correlation. Both predict that changes in brain state will correlate with changes in experience, but they produce opposite predictions about what the changes mean. If the brain produces consciousness, then reducing brain activity should reduce consciousness. If the brain filters consciousness, then reducing brain activity should expand consciousness by loosening the filter, by removing the constraint, by allowing more of the underlying awareness to reach experiential expression. The data Carhart-Harris's psilocybin research, Brewer's meditation research, the terminal lucidity cases, the near-death experience literature is more consistent with the filter prediction than with the production prediction. Less brain activity produces more consciousness, not less. This does not prove the filter theory, but it undermines the neural reduction objection because the objection's foundational assumption that the brain produces consciousness is contradicted by the data that shows consciousness expanding when brain activity decreases. The third objection is the moral responsibility objection. If the I is a construction, if there is no genuine self that authors actions and bears responsibility for their consequences, then moral responsibility evaporates. Who is responsible for the crime if the I that committed it is a confabulation? Who deserves punishment if the self that performed the action is a xeno-stabilized pattern that could dissolve with a change in meditation practice? The dissolution of the self is the dissolution of accountability. And a world without accountability is a world without ethics, without justice, without the social contracts that make civilization possible. Buddhism addresses this objection directly, and the answer is precise. The self is empty, but actions are not empty. Intentions are not empty. Consequences are not empty. The absence of a permanent self does not mean the absence of moral causation. When you perform an action, the action has consequences, consequences that affect other beings, consequences that are real, regardless of whether the agent is a permanent self or a causally continuous process. The karma of the action is determined by the intention's setana, and the intention is real even if the I that claims authorship of the intention is a construction. Responsibility is not attached to the I. Responsibility is attached to the intention, and intentions arise, produce consequences, and create karmic traces regardless of whether they are owned by a permanent self or generated by a selfless process. The practical wisdom here is subtle and important. Recognizing that the self is a construction does not eliminate moral responsibility. It transforms it. The person who recognizes the constructed nature of the self is more morally responsible, not less, because they are no longer defending the ego, no longer rationalizing their behavior through the left hemisphere interpreter's confabulations, no longer trapped in the self-serving narratives that the DMN generates to protect the self-image. The transparent self, the self that sees itself as a construction, is a more honest self, a more compassionate self, a more ethically responsive self than the opaque self that mistakes its constructions for reality. Now, let us trace the connections to every investigation we have conducted. The observer effect is the quantum formulation of the by-identity question. The observer collapses the wave function. The observer creates reality. But the observer is not a physical system. The observer lies outside the quantum description of the physical world. The observer is consciousness, not the narrative self, not the DMN's confabulation, not the left hemisphere interpreter's story, but the awareness that performs the measurement, the awareness that is prior to the measurement's result, the awareness that selects from the superposition without being part of the superposition. Every investigation has circled this awareness. The identity investigation names it. The heart investigation revealed that the body has its own intelligence, its own 40,000 neurons, its own electromagnetic field, its own capacity for perception and communication that operates independently of the brain's narrative self. The heart does not generate an I. The heart does not tell a story. The heart processes information and communicates emotional truth through its electromagnetic field without the intermediation of the narrative self, without the confabulation of the left hemisphere interpreter, without the xeno-stabilized pattern of self-referential processing that the brain generates. The heart's intelligence is selfless intelligence, and its selflessness may be why the traditions identify the heart, rather than the brain, as the seat of the deepest awareness. The placebo investigation demonstrated that the self's beliefs create the self's biology. The narrative self does not merely observe the body. It shapes the body through expectation, through belief, through the stories it tells about health and illness, aging and youth, capacity and limitation. The self is not a passive narrator. It is an active constructor, constructing not only the story of identity, but the biological reality that the story describes, and the recognition that the story is a construction, that the beliefs are beliefs rather than facts, that the expectations are expectations rather than destinies, is the recognition that liberates the biology from the story's constraints. The free will investigation demonstrated that Process 1, the selection of a template operates prior to the selected thought. The selecting consciousness is not the selected thought. Free will is not the narrative self's decision-making. Free will is the attending consciousness's template selection, a quantum process that precedes narrative, that precedes confabulation, that precedes the I, that claims ownership of the decision. Free will is the exercise of the awareness that is prior to the self, the awareness that selects, attends, and observes before the narrative self arrives to claim the credit. The fear investigation demonstrated that the self is the primary target of fear. The amygdala protects the self, the narrative identity, the social standing, the physical body, the psychological integrity of the I, and the chronic fear that accelerates aging, degrades cardiac coherence, and narrows perception is chronic self-protection, the continuous, xeno-stabilized defense of the narrative pattern against every perceived threat. The dissolution of the self, the recognition that the I being defended is a construction, does not eliminate the body's survival mechanisms, but it eliminates the chronic, unnecessary, self-generated fear that the narrative self produces through its continuous anticipation of threats to its own continuity. The self that knows it is a construction does not fear its own dissolution, and the freedom from self-referential fear is, according to both the traditions and the neuroscience, the single most liberating transformation available to a human being. The subconscious investigation revealed that 95% of cognitive processing occurs without the self's involvement, without the narrative, without the confabulation, without the I that claims authorship of conscious experience. The vast majority of what your brain does, what your body does, happens without you. The you that you identify with the conscious, narrative, self-referential I is a tiny fraction of the total cognitive activity, a thin crust on the surface of a vast, deep, largely selfless ocean of processing. And the selfless processing is not inferior to the selfish processing. It is superior, faster, more comprehensive, more accurate, more creative than the conscious processing that the narrative self performs. The I is not the CEO of the mind. It is the press secretary, the spokesperson who takes credit for the organization's work while contributing almost nothing to the actual operations. The karma investigation demonstrated that intentional actions leave traces, and the traces are deposited by the intention, not by the self. Cetana intention is what the Buddhist tradition calls karma, not the I that claims the intention as its own. The karmic trace is real, the consequence is real, the moral weight is real. But the I that takes credit or blame for the karmic action is a post hoc construction. The intention arose, the action occurred, the trace was deposited, and then the I arrived and said, I did that. But the I did not do it. The intention did it. The awareness selected the template through process 1. The brain executed the action through established neural pathways, and the narrative self arriving after the fact, as Libet and Haynes demonstrated, claimed authorship of an action it did not initiate and does not understand. The music investigation revealed that specific frequencies dissolve the self, the 4, 0, hertz, gamma. The frequency associated with lucid dreaming and deep meditation produces the same ego dissolution that the traditions describe as the gateway to deeper awareness. Music is a technology for identity dissolution, the shared singing, the entrainment, the cardiac synchronization that choral music produces, dissolves the boundaries between individuals and creates a collective awareness that transcends the individual self. The aging investigation revealed the deepest biological connection to identity. If aging is information loss, the progressive corruption of the cell's ability to read its own blueprint, then the I may be part of the problem. Chronic self-referential processing, the DMN's continuous narration, the left hemisphere interpreter's continuous confabulation, the Zeno effect's continuous stabilization of the ego pattern is metabolically expensive and neurologically stressful. The DMN consumes a disproportionate share of the brain's energy budget. The self-referential processing generates cortisol through its chronic worry about the self's future and its chronic regret about the self's past. And cortisol, as Blackburn and Eppel demonstrated, accelerates telomere shortening, accelerates epigenetic degradation, and accelerates the information loss that Sinclair identifies as aging. The tradition's prescription to dissolve the self may be, in addition to its spiritual significance, an anti-aging prescription. The meditator who reduces DMN activity reduces the metabolic burden of self-referential processing. The practitioner who dissolves chronic self-referential worry reduces cortisol. The contemplative who experiences moments of ego dissolution experiences moments of deep physiological rest, moments in which the brain's most energy-consuming network is silent, the stress hormones are reduced, and the body's repair systems operate without the interference of the ego's chronic anxiety. The self is not merely a psychological construction, it is a physiological burden, and the lightening of the burden, through contemplative practice, may slow the aging that the burden accelerates. The creativity investigation revealed that the self is the obstacle to creative reception. The ego claims authorship. The narrative self constructs the story of my creativity, and the claiming and the constructing close the channel through which genuinely new information arrives from the implicate order. The creative genius Ramanujan, Tesla, Mozart, Rumi is the individual whose self is transparent enough to allow the creative content to flow through without the ego's distortion. The genius is not the person with the biggest ego. The genius is the person with the thinnest ego, the most transparent filter, the most hollow flute, the emptiest vessel. And the practices that the traditions prescribe for ego dissolution, meditation, prayer, fasting, humility, are simultaneously the practices that optimize creative reception. The spiritual path and the creative path are the same path, the path of self-transparency, of ego thinning, of the progressive recognition that the I is not the source but the obstacle. The concert experience, the worship service, the kirtan, the sema, these are technologies for dissolving the self, through sound, through rhythm, through the physics of entrainment that shifts the brain from the self-referential mode to the selfless mode. The OB investigation demonstrated that consciousness can experience itself as located outside the body, and the proper lucid dreaming investigation demonstrated that consciousness can be aware within a reality it recognizes as a construction. Both investigations point to the same conclusion. Consciousness is not identical to any particular location, any particular body, or any particular self. Consciousness is the awareness that can inhabit any body, any location, any self, and that recognizes, in the lucid dream and in the out-of-body experience, that the inhabitation is a choice rather than a necessity, a construction rather than a given, a perspective rather than a prison. The synchronicity investigation revealed that the awareness beyond the self perceives connections that the self cannot see. Synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences between inner states and outer events, are perceived most clearly when the self is transparent, when the DMN is quiet, when the narrative mind's constant chatter is silenced, and the deeper awareness is free to perceive the patterns that the noise normally conceals. The self is a noise generator. The awareness beyond the self is a pattern perceiver, and the patterns that the awareness perceives, the synchronicities, the meaningful connections, the acausal correlations between mind and world are evidence that the awareness beyond the self is connected to a reality that the self cannot access. The distance and time investigations revealed that the boundaries of the self, the spatial boundary of the body, and the temporal boundary of the lifespan may be features of the self's construction rather than features of awareness itself. If space is emergent from quantum entanglement and time is emergent from informational processing, then the awareness that is prior to the self may also be prior to space and time, not located at a specific point, not confined to a specific moment, not bounded by the spatial and temporal constraints that the self experiences as absolute. The traditions describe this directly. Turiya is present in all states. Atman is eternal. The Gottheit is beyond time. Buddha nature was never born and will never die. The awareness does not exist in space and time. Space and time exist in the awareness as constructions, as features of the explicate order, as properties of the self's perspectival experience, rather than properties of the awareness that generates the perspective. The information investigation established that you are not your atoms, you are the pattern the atoms make. The identity investigation extends this. You are not your thoughts, you are the awareness in which the thoughts appear. The pattern is more fundamental than the medium. The awareness is more fundamental than the content, and the question, who am I, resolves through the neuroscience, through the quantum physics, through the traditions, not into a specific answer, but into a specific recognition. You are the awareness itself, not the content of awareness, not the narrative that awareness generates, not the self that awareness constructs. The awareness, the screen, the ground, the space in which everything, every thought, every feeling, every perception, every self appears and disappears, while the awareness itself remains. The practical implications are immediate. You are thinking right now. A thought is occurring in your mind, but you are not the thought. You are the awareness that is noticing the thought. The thought will pass in seconds, in moments, replaced by another thought, which will also pass, replaced by another, in an endless stream of arising and dissolving mental events that has been flowing since you first became conscious, and that will flow until you die. But the awareness, the noticing, the observing, the silent presence that watches the thoughts come and go does not pass. It does not arise and dissolve. It does not change with the content that it contains. It is the one constant in the river of experience, the riverbed through which the water flows, the screen on which the movie plays, the silence in which the sounds arise. The recognition is available right now, not after years of meditation, not after a pilgrimage to India, not after reading another book or attending another retreat. Right now, in the gap between this thought and the next, the gap is there. It is always there. It is the silence between the words, the space between the notes, the pause between the breaths. And in the gap, if you attend to it, if you notice it, if you rest in it for even a fraction of a second, you will encounter what the traditions have been pointing toward for millennia. Not a concept, not a belief, not a theory, an experience. The direct, immediate, undeniable experience of awareness, without content, consciousness without narrative, being without becoming. The experience lasts a moment, then the thoughts resume, the narrative restarts, the I reassembles, but the moment was real. And the moment was you, the real you, the you that was there before the narrative began, the you that will be there after the narrative ends, the you that is here now, in every gap, in every silence, in every pause, waiting to be noticed. Every tradition says the same thing. Look for the one who is looking. Find the awareness that is aware. Seek the self that does not come and go. And when you find it, not through thinking, but through the cessation of thinking, not through construction, but through the dissolution of construction, not through effort, but through the letting go that every tradition calls by its own name, you will discover what the traditions have been saying for 4,000 years. You were never the thoughts. You were never the narrative. You were never the self that the DMN constructed and the left hemisphere interpreter defended and the Zeno effect stabilized. You were the awareness. Always. From the beginning. Before the first thought arose. Before the first narrative began. Before the first I was constructed. And the awareness, if the physics and the traditions are both pointing in the right direction, is not a product of the brain. It is not generated by neurons. It is not created by the body. It is the thing that the brain receives, that the neurons mediate, that the body channels. It is the consciousness that the filter constrains, the awareness that the eye conceals, the ground that the construction covers. And it was here before you were born, and it will be here after you die, and it is here now, right now, in this moment, reading these words, noticing the thoughts that these words produce, watching the narrative self react to the suggestion that it is not what it thinks it is. You are not your thoughts. You are the silence between them. And the silence vast, luminous, unconditioned, and free is what you have always been.